Hello, my name is Elise Schrader. Today's date is Tuesday, March 26, 2019. I'm interviewing Dr. Arno Wittig on the Ball State campus as part of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. Thank you, Dr. Wittig, for agreeing to participate in this effort, which we're conducting during this, the Honors College's 60th anniversary year.
Well, thanks for asking me. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so if you wouldn't mind, could we start by discussing when and where you were born?
I was born in Buffalo, New York, 3 days before Germany invaded Poland, August 29th, 1939. And that's sort of significant in my family because my grandparents came from Germany on my father's side, and they were distinctly of an anti-Nazi persuasion and actually lived in Pennsylvania area. My grandfather designed steam locomotives and was sort of seduced from Kaiserslautern, Germany, to come to the United States and design locomotives for a company here. And he was influenced and got out of the Pittsburgh area because of the strength of the Bund, if you would, there. And when I was a kid, for example, my brother, my sister, and I were not allowed to speak or learn German because it was the wrong thing at that time, during World War II. And so we knew, for example, we really knew we were in trouble when mom or dad would switch and yell at us in German. then we knew something had gone wrong. But it was, kind of an interesting situation for a childhood to be just as a major conflict was occurring, and to be raised. And the first memories include a lot of stuff having to do with the war.
So you mentioned your grandparents. Were they a large influence in your life growing up?
No, in fact, they died quite young. Well, I shouldn't say that. My mother's mother was a big influence. She was the only grandparent who lived long enough for me to really remember her. My mom's father died fairly young as well. He was Scottish extraction, and actually, and my grandmother came from Canada. It's a very much blended kind of family. And after he died, and my dad died just after my 6th birthday. And so all of a sudden, then here's my mother with 3 young children, and her mother then came and lived with us. And she was with us for the next, till I was a freshman in college, so the next 11 years, I guess. And she was a big influence. She wasn't a highly educated in terms of formal education person, but she, for example, loved words. And so all of us became kind of language oriented, and there were a lot of those kinds of things, but there was still lots of family. My father was one of 9 children, 7 of whom lived to be adults, and there were others of the family in the Buffalo area. And so there was a kind of a Wittig influence, but not from my grandparents as such.
Then could you just say your grandparents or your grandmother's name that helped raise you?
My grandmother was Olivia Blow Petrie, and it leads to one of the funny lines in the family because her grandfather was Joseph Blow, so my great-great-grandfather was Joe Blow.
Okay, and then your parents' names?
I'm sort of a junior, but not
Okay.
quite. My dad was christened. My grandparents, for some reason, decided that all the children should have 3 names before the Wittig. And so my dad was originally Arno Franz Martin Wittig, right? And I had an aunt, Elsa Augusta Amelia Wittig, and I'm Arno Frank. I'm I guess you'd say anglicized version of that name. So I'm sort of a junior, but maybe not quite. And my mother was Grace Elizabeth Petrie, and then she married my dad, so she was Grace Elizabeth Petrie Wittig.
And then you mentioned a brother and sister. What was
I have
your
an older
relationship?
brother, William Petrie Wittig. He's 4.5 years older than I. He's the reason that I'm here at Ball State, because he was teaching on the faculty and I came for a visit and ended up here. He is a professional musician, pretty much retired now. He taught here and played as the principal flutist in the Muncie Symphony Orchestra, and then left and finished his career teaching at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and playing for the Springfield, Massachusetts Orchestra during the regular year, playing for the London Chamber Players in the summers, and my sister is Grace Ann. She was Grace Ann Wittig. She's Grace Ann Wittig Owens, married to a history professor at, he was at Idaho State University. They've now retired and moved to Boise, and he's associated with Boise State now. And Grace was a Spanish teacher, a high school Spanish teacher, and she's 4.5 years younger than I.
What would you say your child life was growing up with him?
A very unusual childhood, and for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one being that my dad died. He had a brain tumor in the occipital lobe. He was just past 40, just in his very early 40s. They decided, I found out many years later, they decided to try the operation. And supposedly the operation went okay to remove the tumor, but he was dead in less than 48 hours. There's some question in the family as to whether he died from hemorrhaging that it blew out after the surgery, or the possibility that he contracted pneumonia in the surgical process. But it didn't matter. He was dead on the 1st of October in 1945. And Mom and Dad had been, as I guess supposedly probably pretty typical, they'd been part of a group of young married couples with children. And now all of a sudden here she is with 3 young children and no spouse. And with the exception of one fella, most of the other friends, if you will, didn't keep incorporating her into the group. And what happened was the superintendent of schools lived down the street from us, and both principals also lived on our street. It was a closed block. And Philip Schweikart was his name. He walked down one day, knocked on the door and said, "Grace, I know that you have a teaching license, and I know that you have 3 young children, and I know that you're probably struggling a little bit for money, and I have a teaching position for you next year if you want to come teach." And she said, "Okay, I guess I will." And so she taught in the high school that I eventually attended, and that was pretty much, and her friends then came from people she associated with, and they were the ones who didn't have connections. They were the ones who, like my mom, were maybe a little ostracized for one reason or another. There was a couple, for example, the woman taught French and the man taught speech and theater and things like that. And she was Roman Catholic and he was Jewish. And they were in love. But the families were just, no, we can't do this. And so they waited until all the parents died. And they didn't get married until they were in their 40s. And eventually ended up celebrating a 50th wedding anniversary together in their 90s, which was marvelous, And they were friends. They would be at the house visiting. And there were 3 gay guys. And in the 1940s and 1950s, that was, but they were often in the house for dinner. And There was a woman who was blind who wrote for the newspaper, and Catherine Smith was her name, and she taught me how blind people pour coffee and how you tuck your finger over the rim of the cup and pour until you just feel it touch the. It was an unusual, a very different kind of. Oh, there was a couple. The first, we now say African American. At the time, they were Negroes. The first Negro couple to live in our community, and he was a physician, and she was a professor of foreign languages, who had pretty good documentation that she was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, from the Thomas Jefferson-Sally Hemings combination. And they were great fun, just wonderful people. And they were around. In fact, Lloyd, was the person who gave my sister away at her wedding. And that was, it's a very different kind of group. You didn't expect to have that kind of combination. That's just what we grew up with. We didn't think anything about it. And many years later, I was making a presentation here on campus and left some time for questions and answers afterwards. And a student put up his hand and he said, "What did the neighbors think?" And I don't know. And I really don't know, because the street we were on was kind of little German America. It was a whole bunch of people who were descended from, much like my dad, first generation Americans descended from people who had come from the old country. And there weren't any Negroes, blacks, African Americans, call them whatever, there weren't any. It was just, a very interesting upbringing.
So with all those influences coming at you from outside, was your mother your central influence?
To a great extent, sure. Yeah, she was very insistent that we maintain as much of a normal progression as possible. All of us really took to school. We all enjoyed being in school. We worked hard at it, and she did too. And it was very interesting. For about 13 years, Bill started college in 1952, and Mom took a loan, a one-year loan, 12 payments. She took it out on July 1, she paid it off on June 30th and took the next loan. And for 13 years in a row, she did that every year to help us. And we all worked, and we all had scholarship help, and we all made it through, and all ended up with advanced degrees, all ended up teaching, not necessarily intentionally, but we all ended up teaching. And Bill was going to be, he actually came to Indiana as a performer with the Indianapolis Symphony. He was a flutist in the Indianapolis Symphony. And I think Grace was the only one who really intended to teach right from the start. I actually had a contract with offered to me with IBM, and I thought I was going to be a psychologist in industry, but obviously ended up as a teacher.
So you said your mom taught at the high school you ended up attending, which was Amherst Central High School,
That's
correct?
Right, yes.
Okay. What was your high school experience like?
A little unusual, but mostly really good. It was an excellent faculty. I brag about the school because the year that I graduated, 1956, the New York Times had an article about Amherst Central, about the 50 best public high schools in the country, and Amherst was one of them. 50 years later, just before it went out of print, Newsweek had an article in it about the 100 best public high schools in the country, and Amherst was in it. It's that kind. I graduated in 1956. 93% of my high school class went to college, and that's, for a public high school, that's just, and back then that was unbelievable. We had basically everything you could possibly want. We had a performing arts wing that had a choral room, an orchestra room, a band room, a theater room, a really good auditorium, 2 gyms, 2 swimming pools, Think of that, 2 swimming pools in a school, where does that come from? The town of Amherst never turned down a school levy. They were just willing to put the money into it regardless. And part of my saying it was a little unusual, I was younger than everybody. I graduated from high school when I was 16, and I actually had my 17th birthday 3 days before I left for college. I never drove on a date until after I was in college, because New York State had a law at the time that you could get your driver's license at 16, but you could only drive during the daylight with that license, and you had to wait until you were 17 if you had had driver education. Then you could drive after dark. So I never once drove on a date until I was in college. So there were some, and I couldn't play ball. You had to be 14 years old to play on junior varsity or varsity. And even though I was probably good enough, my freshman year I couldn't play except on the freshman basketball team. I couldn't play any other sport because I wasn't old enough. So there were trade-offs. Later it was wonderful, because many years later I made the rule of 85 to retire early. So, the age and the years of service added up to 85, and so I was able to retire a long 23 years ago.
What type of interest did you develop in high school? Because when you went to college, you majored in a bunch of different things. And so how did you start to gain those interests? Was that in high school, or?
I think it was, I really think it was, yes, but it was being around such a diverse group of people, being associated with people who just loved learning in so many respects. And I started college thinking I was going to be an architect. And I spent 2 years at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute studying to be an architect. And I came home at the end of the second year and I said, "Mom, I made a mistake." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "They want all of me all the time. And I can't give that, because there are other things I want to do. I wanted to play ball. I wanted to go on a date once in a while. I wanted to go to a concert once in a while. I wanted to have something other than architecture in my life." And by chance, I was playing summer baseball, and I told a friend of mine that I was thinking I just need to do something else. And he said, "Go talk to John Wittig at Hobart College." And and I said, "Who's John Wittig?" And he said, "Well, he's the guy who's in charge of these kinds of things." And I drove the 100 miles from Buffalo to Geneva, New York, and went in and talked to John Wittig. And I said, "I think I might be interested in transferring." And he said, "Oh, we're full." And then we talked a little more, and we talked a little more. And he said, "Are you in a rush?" And I said, "No, not particularly." He said, "Well, just sit back here, get you a cup of coffee or something." And he disappeared. And about 25 or 30 minutes later, he came back. And he said, "Okay, you need to get this application in within the next week." He said, "Here's your schedule for fall." And I said, "Mr. Wittig, could you?" And he said, "Well, I just called some profs and asked them if they'd take one extra. These are classes you're going to need when you're here." And he just got me in. And so I went home and I said, "Mom, I'm going to Hobart." And she said, "Really?" And fortunately, I had a New York State scholarship, a Regents scholarship, that transferred from one school to another. And so I could use it at Hobart. And so I just went to Hobart, and then I didn't know what I was going to do for sure, but I ended up sort of majoring in psychology and sociology and English a little bit. And I worked, I was the news director of the radio station, the campus radio station, and just did a bunch of different kinds of things. And then finally ended up in psychology because the guy who was my psychology advisor, a fellow named Harold Babb, did all the arranging. And I get a call. I'm sitting in the dining service, and one of the guys comes over and says, "Dr. Babb's on the phone, wants to talk to you." And I thought, what is it? I'd taken an exam in his class that day, and I thought, did I really? And I went over and he said, "You got a few minutes?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir." And he said, "Come over to my house." And he lived right by campus. And so I went over to the house, and I'm thinking, "Oh, God," I really was worried. And Marjorie, his wife, met me at the door, and she said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Oh, well, yeah, that would be nice." And she said, "Maybe a couple of brownies?" And I thought, "Oh, that would even be nicer," And she took me back to his office, and he said, "Oh, hi." He said, "Here, I got something for you to read." And he hands me this piece of paper, and across the top it says, "The Ohio State University." I think, ooh, and it says, "Well, yes, we can admit him. He'll have to send his stuff in pretty quickly, but we can admit him. And actually, I've got an assistantship, and he can start in spring quarter." They were on quarters. "He can start in spring quarter 6 weeks from now." And Dr. Babb looks at me and says, "So you want it?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I do." and that was how I ended up with what I started doing. So I went to Ohio State and studied psychology, and it was all because he had arranged it. But that's the way that school was. They still do. They take care of you. They're great that way.
And so you went to Ohio State in 1961, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and so that's where you got your master's and PhD in psychology?
I did, yes.
What was your experience like there? Was it different than Hobart?
My gosh. Yes. Ohio State's huge. I lived just across the street from campus in a basement apartment that was 6 feet high, and I'm 6'2", so I was always ducking in my apartment, but it was cheap. And one Saturday, I decided, I'm an exerciser, and I decided I'm just going to walk from my corner of campus to the other corner of campus. It took me an hour and a half. It's just gigantic. And then I rode the shuttle bus back. and the football was big and basketball was big. They were national champions in basketball while I was there. And it was quite a different experience. But within the psychology part of it, it was very much like what I had experienced. My advisor was a fellow named Dallas Wickens, who actually won the award as the outstanding teacher in the country from the American Psychological Association. And he was just terrific and really took care of us. And he pushed us and guided us at the same time and made things happen for us. And I was on, I guess you'd say, the fast track for a bunch of reasons. I met the woman who became my first wife, and we really wanted to get married, and so I sort of speeded up things a little bit. And Dr. Babb got a leave of absence for a year, and he called me and said, "Do you want to come back to your alma mater and teach?" So at age 23, I went back and I was a college prof and teaching full time while I was writing my dissertation, and had a lot of good experience there. And then I ended up here the next year for, well, it's quite a story actually. I'll give you this sort of the short version of it. But I was teaching, and it was the year John Kennedy got killed. And that was a Friday, and I was scheduled to take my oral exams the following Tuesday, go back to Columbus and take my oral exams in general oral exams. And I'm teaching a class Friday afternoon, and one of the secretaries comes to the door and goes like this, and I went over and she said, "You need to tell the class that the president has been killed, and there will be a memorial ceremony at 4 o'clock in the chapel, and classes are dismissed now." And I'm thinking, "Oh God, this is not exactly right." So I went back and told the class that the president was dead, and then we just went about kind of closing up shop and doing things. And as a new faculty member, I was actually scheduled to go to dinner that night at the provost's house, a fellow named Ben Atkinson. And his wife called later afternoon. She said, "I've got all the food. You all come over." And so everybody went to this dinner, and the president had just been shot and killed moments ago. And it was a very unusual thing. But then we left, and I went out for my oral exams, and there were no classes. The classes were canceled then for that it was Thanksgiving week. And did my oral exams on Tuesday morning, and then came over here because my brother Bill was here on the faculty, and he had said, "Come for Thanksgiving dinner. If you're going to be out in the Midwest anyway now, come over and see me." So my wife and I drove over here. I'm thinking we're having Thanksgiving dinner at Bill's house. No, we're having it at the neighbor's house who lived behind it. And the neighbors were both Ball State faculty as well, Roger and June Easton. Roger was in the art department and June was in elementary ed. And one of the guests, in addition, at that dinner was a fellow named Leslie J. Moth, who was here in Teachers College. And as we're sitting before dinner, he's talking with me, and I'm not thinking, well, he's doing an interview. As we get up to go to the table, he says, "We'd have the perfect job for you next year." And I said, "Oh, I'd never want to live in Muncie." A little embarrassing. By Christmas, I was back here interviewing. By January, I signed the contract because we were newlyweds, and not only did my salary jump considerably, but they gave my wife, who was just finishing her bachelor's degree, a graduate assistantship for the following year. We thought we were in hog heaven, it was marvelous. And so we came here thinking, well, we'll be here 2 or 3 years. That was 1964, and I'm still here.
All right, so what was that first year of teaching at Ball State compared to your year teaching at Hobart?
It was different in a number of respects. Hobart was founded in the 1800s and was a gorgeous, small, well put together campus. Ball State, of course, was founded somewhat later and was also involved in some things that really we're talking leftover from World War II. I came here, my office was in a barracks building, this wooden thing that's over where the Teachers College is now located. And my classroom to teach experimental psychology was in that same barracks building. I had a graduate assistant to help me with that class, but he wasn't in psychology. He was in industry and technology, or whatever it was called at the time, to help build equipment for the lab. Because I came here as the first and only that first year experimental psychologist to teach experimental methods to students. And that was quite a shock to go from an old brick building with a nice office with big windows to this barracks building kind of thing, and to work in that kind of circumstance was different. But for whatever reasons, it seemed good, and we stayed, and we ended up staying and never leaving. And Jean and I were married for 30 years, eventually separated and divorced, but she stayed on until she retired as well, and we both had job offers other places, but never together, and never could work it. I was offered a job back in Buffalo, and they needed somebody with her specialty in her department, but they had a nepotism rule and they couldn't hire both of us on the faculty at the same time. And so we just ended up staying here.
So 1964 is the year when you came. It was also the year that the Faculty Senate voted to become a university. So Ball State changed from a teacher's college to a university. and that also meant more students were looking towards non-teaching majors. Did you find that you were interacting with a lot of students that were interested in majors outside of teaching?
Not at first. No, not at first. It was still, I'd say, oh golly, 5-6 years before that really had any major influence on what was going on. We still were primarily associated with preparing teachers, and the programs were designed around that kind of thing. And eventually, we'll jump ahead a little bit here, but for example, with the honors program here, we ended up never having an honors mathematics class because there were so many different ways that teachers got licensed, and the different kinds of math classes that were expected made it impossible. So many of the honor students were in education, we just couldn't do it. And the teaching influence, the preparation of teachers was very important. Well into the middle to late 1970s.
So then, a few years after 1968, John Emmons retires, and then John J. Pruis became the 7th president. Mm-hmm. How would you describe that transition from Emmons to Pruis?
Difficult, because Jack Emmons was Ball State. Just to give you an example of what he was like, he and his wife. When my daughter Julie was born in 1966, the first people to come pull in the driveway with a little present and say congratulations after Jean and Julie came home from the hospital were Jack and Aileen Emmons. They just did it. This was just a huge family for them, and he was such a part of the place. He bowled in our faculty bowling league, and he was active in all. When there used to be a Saturday morning when you could come get tulip bulbs that were being dug up here on campus, and Jack would be out there digging the bulbs and handing them out to people with all the others. He just was involved in all of the kinds of things. And John Pruis was a very fine president. Don't get me wrong, but he was a different kind of attitude. A little different feeling to him, and so the transition was a noticeable transition. We became, in a sense, a little more formal with John Pruis. Yeah.
And also, one of the big controversies with Pruis was in 1975 when he hired an outside source, Robert H. Hayes and Associates, to study the compensation system of the administration, and it became known as the Hayes Study. Could you discuss what it was like on campus as a faculty member while that was happening?
Well, the whole salary concern was a big thing for a long time. There was this one page of a salary schedule, and it was fixed, and it was simply seniority, and you knew exactly what the steps would be each time, each year. Only way you got big advances was to get promoted from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, until you were a full professor. But there was no merit pay, no flexible compensation whatsoever. And many of the quote unquote older guard faculty wanted it that way. They were perfectly content with that. And some of the younger people, and especially some of them coming out of disciplines where there was very high demand at the time, thought there ought to be more flexible pay system in place. It made for some unfortunately unpleasant kinds of things. There were shout-outs in the Senate and a lot, and there was actually a modest attempt at forming a union to try to develop a union negotiation process. It fell through probably for the better, I think, in terms of how the university eventually developed. It was a big campus controversy, no question about that.
And so then the year following, right after that, in 1976, that's when the Honors College offered their first Whitinger Scholarship, and you were actually approached by Dr. Warren Vanderhill to be on the selection committee. So what type of process was that, looking for the different students that you wanted to bring in?
That's an interesting circumstance because the program came about in kind of an unusual manner. All of a sudden, here was this opportunity to have something like this, and from the very beginning, I think what we decided was we're going to try to select people who not only will be successful students now, the next 4 or 5 years, but people who 20 years from now will be able to say, there, see, look how this person has developed, look how this person has, and fortunately, in many respects, that's exactly what has happened. We were looking, I think from the very beginning, we were looking at the long term. We were looking at not just people who can come and get a good grade point average, but people who would be somebody, you know, and not to say that it had to be somebody who all of a sudden had a big name, big public recognition, or any of that kind of thing, but rather would make a contribution in whatever field he or she decided to do. There's one, for example, that comes to mind just out of nowhere, who has been a anchor person for years on a television station and is just loved in the community, just, you know, and has had a wonderful career and a great life and very successful in what she does, and that kind of thing. And of course, there's some I mentioned before we got started. You know, there's Jeff Feldman, who's now an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Well, that's terrific too. The Whitinger Scholars over the years have been such an unusual one who comes to mind. Melinda Harmon was a basketball player in high school who blew out her knee at a picnic and never could play in college, even though she was good enough that she would have if her knee hadn't. And she was told, as a high school student, someday you'll probably have to have an artificial knee. Came here, and I happened to do the Whitinger interview with her, and I, among other things, said to her, so what are you going to major in? And she said, physics and athletic training. And I said, really? You know, I said, that's quite a combination. Why? And then she told me about the knee, and she told me about, and she eventually became one of the world's experts in artificial joints. And she's now a professor at Clemson University, and that was her all along. That was her goal. She was so curious about that. And so she put together physics and athletic training to learn about these kinds of things. And now among other things, I haven't talked with her for a while now, but she was the kind of person that when one of the artificial joints failed, they'd send it to Mindy. They'd send it and say, could you figure out what happened? Why did this mess up? You know, she's become the artificial joint guru. And I think the whole idea of that scholars program has been reflected by those kinds of things. Sometimes you don't hear a lot about it, but my golly, you know, they really do good things.
Was that your first involvement with the Honors College at Ball State?
Pretty much, yes. I taught an honors section of introductory psychology, and I honestly can't tell you whether I started just before or just after the Whitinger Scholars thing started. But we had honors sections of some of the regular general studies classes, and I was teaching the honors section of intro. And then Warren asked me to be on that selection committee, and I was on that actually for the first 25 years of the program on the Whitinger Scholars. And once I got involved in it, I realized, boy, this is terrific. And it sort of reflects the kind of person that I am, because one of the great advantages of being the dean of the Honors College is that you get to work with every major on campus. And there's always something different and something new, almost every day. And I think I'm just that kind of person. I never could really settle on what I wanted to, you know, I keep saying I haven't decided what I'm going to be when I grow up, you know, because I just like to learn new and different things. And in honors, you get to do that all the time. That's one of the pleasures.
So you mentioned that once you were more involved with it, your impression of it sort of changed. So what was your impression of honors before you became involved, when you were just a professor just within the university?
I don't think I realized the emphasis was more on becoming an educated person and not a trained person. And what I mean by that, and I think it's still true today, is that honors students, the expectation for honors students is that you're going to be much better educated when you leave here. And I think with that expectation is, and you'll be employable. But the attitude, the cultural attitude in education in general, in college education in general, has changed so much over the 50 years. And honors education here hasn't pushed along with that so much. There was a study at UCLA that started back in the 1960s, and incoming freshmen were asked, why are you going to college? And in the first year of the study, 80% of them said to get a good education. By 50 years later, in the early 2000s, 80% said to get a job. And that's how much change there has been with what is happening with education in general. I don't think that has happened with honors education here. I think we're still looking at the idea of becoming a well-educated person, and something will fall into place. I just talked with a student a week or so ago, maybe a little longer, who is just enamored. She didn't come here with any thought of this at all, and was majoring, I think, in biology, got into scuba stuff, was told, gee, we have an aquatics program here at Ball State. She said, really, we do? Started taking the aquatics courses, and now is getting ready to graduate and is looking at whether or not she can find something associated with all of this she's trained to be a scuba instructor, but not that that's necessarily what but she just loves it, and it just came out of nowhere. But it was that idea that, gee, you want to learn about something else? Okay, let's learn about something else. Okay.
So you'd mentioned that you began teaching honors courses. How did you feel did you feel like you had to alter your teaching style for honor students compared to just the average students in your normal psychology classes?
Sure, yeah. And you have to understand that the students, I have the wide range. I've taught a lot of honors classes, obviously, but I also, at least for some time, I don't know whether I still do or not, but I held the university record for teaching the largest class ever. I taught introductory psychology in Bruce Hall with 651 students in the class. And you just do different things. And the pace has to be different. The expectation of how well they will understand the reading has to be different. You go into an honors class and expect them to read and understand, and if they don't understand, to ask. In some of the other classes, that's simply not the expectation, and make adjustments accordingly. Not to say that I didn't enjoy the other classes, because I did. I really, that sounds kind of goofy to say, gee, you really like teaching a class of 600, but boy, when you had a good day, and you have 600 and some people sitting out there going, oh, wow, oh, and you just got something through, that feels awfully good. When people ask me what I did as a career, I always say I was a teacher, because that's really, more than anything, that's what I did. Didn't matter whether it was in the office or whether it was in the classroom or whether it was on campus, or I coached for a bunch of years. I just taught.
Did you feel that the honors classes gave you more of a chance to interact with students, like personally, and get to know them better than the larger lectures that you taught?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I'll brag a little bit here, but I say that the single best award that I ever received was when the first class of Whitinger scholars asked me to be the faculty person who spoke at their senior dinner. And I had had almost all of them in an honors introductory class, and to this day, I mean, we're still buddies. Some of we still are in contact, and that's nice. That's I think sometimes people B.F. Skinner was here to receive an honorary degree. I don't know how many years ago now, a bunch of years ago. And Skinner, of course, is a world-renowned psychologist, and I got the chance to be his host for a number of hours. And we were sitting and talking, and I'd met him before, but we were sitting and talking, and I said to him, was there any one class that you especially liked teaching more than any other? And I meant by discipline. I was thinking you'd like to teach this or that, and he said, oh yeah. He said it was a introductory psychology class in 1932 at the University of Minnesota before I left for Harvard. And I thought, what? And he said, I had 23 people in the class. And he said 7 of them eventually went in and got PhDs in psychology, and another one of them became the governor of Minnesota. And he said, we still have reunions every year at my place on Cape Cod, and as many of them as can come, and we all, I'm thinking, you gotta be kidding me. He was teaching an introductory psych class at the University of Minnesota, and 50 years later, that class is still getting together. And it was just, wow, and to some extent, that was the kind of thing that I felt any number of times. There's a faculty member here I won't name who's married to a former Whitinger scholar, and she was a student of mine in the Honors 199 class, and wrote a paper that to this day I can still tell you about that paper because it was just so darn good. And I'll see her on occasion and have subsequently seen her children and been able to say, your mom wrote it. This great paper. Yes, the interaction, I think, is probably one of the best aspects of the entire thing. It's what I miss most. I taught until I was 75 years old, and I don't miss the grading the exams, and I don't miss reading the term papers, and I don't miss a lot of that kind of stuff. But I like the interaction still, and I still try to find ways to be around people like that, people who are still,
So you eventually became Dean of the Honors College in 1986.
Right.
Were you afraid that becoming Dean you would lose that interaction you had with the students when you were just a professor?
No, not at all. And I can tell you, I wasn't worried about that at all because we already had an ambiance. Warren had created an atmosphere, and the people in the office. Bill Hendy was working with me then, and Pat Jeffers was there as the secretary, and it was. No, I wasn't worried at all that it was going to change because there was an interactive kind of attitude that existed, and we maintained it. And I think, to be honest, I think we still maintain it. I think 20 years now since I've been there, but it's still that way. There's still that feeling of closeness that exists, and it's good.
So before you were selected as the dean, you gave an interview to the Ball State Daily News in 1986, and you were discussing some of the things you wanted to change about or alter about the Honors College. And so I was just wondering if we could go through those. And one of the first ones was you wanted to discuss the high dropout rate due to people not wanting to complete their senior thesis. And so, yeah.
It's always been a problem. And it's often a question of what else is happening for the person. I remember one student coming in and telling me she was dropping out of honors, and I said, really? I said, my gosh, all you have to do is finish your thesis. And she said, I know. She said, but I'm out of here. I'm out of here right now. I don't need the credits, and I really can't turn this down. And I said, what are you going to do? And she said, well, I've got a job with this tech company, and she was in computer science, this is the boom time for this sort of thing. And she said, and she told me her salary. And it was $9,000 more. She was just finishing her bachelor's degree, and it was $9,000 more than we were paying new PhDs to come in here as a professor, assistant professor. She's going to start, and I said, yeah, I understand. And she never did finish her honors because of that. There were a number of those kinds of instances. I don't think it was distress with the thesis or the creative project as much as it was often timing and other kinds of aspects. We make it a requirement to be an honors graduate that you do something like that, and we pay the price perhaps for that. Yeah.
One of the other things that you mentioned that you wanted to work on within the Honors College was the ability to attract more minority students. And so how do you think you went about trying to attract more minority students to the Honors College?
Fairly unsuccessfully. I won't say that we haven't had any success because we've had some good opportunities, but a lot of that has to do with the culture of Muncie, Indiana, and factors over which we have no control, and that continues to be a problem. How you get by those problems, I don't know. To this day, I don't think we've been terribly successful, and it's not for want of trying, but it's simply the reality of where Ball State is located and what kind of community we have and what kind of opportunities we have to offer and what other schools have to offer, and we don't compete terribly well there.
And then one of the last things you mentioned was an increase in availability of advising for freshmen. And so how do you think that would help set them up for better success within the Honors College?
The first year is so crucial. And we did expand the advising. We added another person, and we tried to get people started correctly, get them started so that there would be initial successes and get them interested in that sense of being a really well-educated person. And you have to understand, Elise, that we're competing against all kinds of influences in this sort of thing. We lost a student one time, and I got a mother just furious with me because she and her son came, he was still in high school, and he was honors eligible, and we're sitting and talking, and she was not very happy with it. And I said, what's bothering you? And she said, I don't understand why he needs this honor stuff. And I said, well, he doesn't need the honor stuff. I said, but he'll be a well-educated person if he does the honors things. And she said, yeah, but he's going to become an accountant. And this is where I probably messed up a little bit. And I said, so what do you think an accountant does? And she looked at me and she wouldn't respond. And I said, just crunch numbers? And she said, yeah, just crunch numbers. I said, no. I said, an accountant works with people and works for people and has to know something about what those people are doing to be good at accounting. And your son's not going to be a good accountant if he can't understand what those businesses are about. And I went on, elaborating on this theme of if you're a better educated person. And I gave her the example from my own brothers. My brother was building a house and wanted a music room. And he had a guy helping him with the design, and this guy designed a room that had all these angles in it. And Bill said, no. This is a music room. It has to be acoustically. And the guy said, but look, I saved these trees. Look at the view you'll have. He said, but it's not a music room. And the fellow just didn't understand anything about music. He could design something that looked wonderful, but didn't function for the kind of life that my brother had. And I was trying to explain to her that her son could crunch the numbers like crazy, but if he couldn't satisfy the customer, he wasn't going to be a good accountant. And she just did not like that. And he called me about 3 weeks later and told me he was going to another school. He said, Mom won't let me come to Ball State. So it happens. It's a cultural thing in many respects, and it's the kind of thing that you're always overcoming this in one regard or another.
So you obviously got the position as dean, and you replaced Dr. Warren Vanderhill.
Right.
What was he like to work with before you took over for his position?
Oh, he was so dedicated. This was his academic life for years. And when the provost, Jim Cook, asked him to become associate provost, and I didn't know anything about this. I was sitting in my office, and the phone rang. So I answered the phone, and it's Jim's secretary, and she says, are you busy? And I said, yeah. She said, do you think you could come over here for a few minutes? Dr. Cook wants to talk with you. And I said, yeah, sure. And we had interacted a lot because I had been involved with University Senate and a bunch of different kinds of things. And so I walked over to the ad building and go in, and she says, come on out there. And she takes me back, and Warren is sitting there with Jim. And Jim says, well, Warren's going to be associate provost, and so we need somebody to run the honors thing. How about you? And I thought, oh, really? And it's just out of nowhere. One moment I'm a professor of psychology sitting in my office worrying about the next article I'm going to write or the next book that I'm working on or something like that. And the next minute, I'm going to be at the time, director of honors, because it wasn't quite a deanship yet. And I said, well, God, let me think about it for a little bit, but I think, yeah. And I went home to talk to my wife and talked to the people in psychology and decided, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And so then I was reporting to Warren, because now he was in charge of that as the associate provost. And so, yeah, he just, and to this day still is, so committed to honors education and has been all his entire career, just, I guess, as I have.
So once you took over that position, what was a typical day for you like?
There was no such thing. That's what's so great about the job. There is no typical day. And the only thing that I insisted when I talked to Jim and Warren about the job, I said, I don't want to lose my identity in psychology. And so I continued to teach psychology classes, even though I was heading up the honors thing. And that was, I had a reasonably substantial identity in psychology, and I was publishing some books and involved in a lot of things in psychology, and I just didn't want to give up, suddenly drop all of that and be away from it. And so they agreed that would be okay, that I could arrange my schedule so it would work out. So the only thing that was typical was that I would teach a section of introductory psychology in the fall semester, and I would teach a section of history of psychology in the spring semester. And I continued to do that, well, until I retired, and then after. I just stayed with the teaching for a long time. I couldn't give up that part of it. But beyond that, my golly, you just never knew. And the kinds of things that would show up for honors were different from so many other aspects of what goes on campus. As an example, I wondered for a long time why it was that honors housing, which was a student suggestion to begin with when Warren was doing it, but why honors housing wasn't getting upgrades. All the other buildings were getting upgrades. They're getting new this and new that and new other thing. And at the time, our students were out in Botsford and Swinford, and some spill over into Schmidt and Wilson. And finally one day, Joanne Edmonds, by that point, was the associate or assistant dean. And she and I went over to the housing office. We had an appointment, went over to the housing office, talked with Alan Hargrave and his assistant, and said, what's the deal? How is it that everybody else is getting stuff and honors isn't? And he looked at me very straight-facedly said, because they don't do any damage. And I said, what? He said, honor students don't damage things. He said, everything's still in great shape. And he said, the other halls, things get ruined. So we have to replace them. So we upgrade when we replace. And I thought, you gotta be kidding me, but but that was the explanation. The honor students weren't doing anything bad, and so as a result, they weren't getting anything good. What a circumstance. But that was, you just never knew quite what might happen, what might show up. We had one coach, Karen Fitzpatrick was the field hockey coach, and she came one day and she said, how do I get on the honors subcommittee? And I said, just put your name into the University Senate and see if they'll put you on. And she said, I want to do that. And I thought, all right, how often do you think a coach comes and says, I want to be involved in honors education? But her starting lineup at one point was more than half honor students. And she loved it because honor students got a presidential scholarship, and that meant there was more money available for scholarships for some of the other athletes that she had. And she got a lot of good players. They got up into the top, I think they got into the top 8 in the country at one point with a whole bunch of honor students out there playing, and you just, each day something, it was almost like something new would show up, something different would happen. And that's what I liked about the job. And I think that's what makes it such a good educational program, because it is so varied.
You had mentioned housing and offices, which has always been an issue for the honors program. And while you were dean, the offices moved from Whitinger to Burkhart. And so why was it important for you to try and find a central location for honors faculty and students?
I think my goal was to try to help build the image some and make it more attractive. When we were recruiting students in Burkhart building, it was all business except for our little tiny area. And then when we moved here, we had a nice office downstairs here in the Burkhart building, and we could look out the window, and there was the quad, and I pushed hard to try to get an honors house. Never had success. There was a building across the street that alumni office was in, and part of it eventually got moved over and is used for the academy over here on University. And I wanted that. It was right dead center, but that's where Sursa Hall sits now. I wanted, because it was right in the center of campus, right at the scramble light, and that would have been just wow, to have the honors college right there, and you bring students in and say, look at us, we're the center of campus. This is nice. And the housing was all the way on the north end, up by the duck pond. And eventually then, just as I was retiring the first time, and Bruce Meyer was coming in as dean, the offices got moved to Carmichael Hall right out there by the housing. And we had some classrooms assigned to us out there in Carmichael then. And so that helped some to make more of a coordinated kind of thing. And then of course when Jim Rubel came in and we got the house given to us, Ed Virginia gave us, and then got housing right across the street there, that was terrific, because now we're back in the center of campus, and that's really nice, And the hope is, I think still, that area behind, that maybe we'll get another small building with some honors classrooms in that green space someday. So, but yes, we've tried for a long time to try to build the image, but honors was often almost like a stepchild, sort of oh yeah, we love you, but. and there was always something that might take a little priority. The housing thing, just as an example, we love you, but you're last on the list for repairs because we don't, for upgrades because we don't have to do repairs. And that kind of thing was true. Getting faculty members to teach. There was one semester where we had a full section, had 25 students in a class, 26 actually, I think it was one over. And I got a call 2 days before the fall semester started from the chair of a department saying, oh, I'm sorry, but you can't have him. And I said, what do you mean I can't have him? He's assigned to this class. Not anymore. And I said, you got to be kidding me. What am I going to do with these 26 students? He said, I don't know, and hung up. Yeah. And fortunately, I found somebody who ended up being a terrific teacher. And once she did it once, she decided she would stay on, and she taught for the rest of her career in honors. But that was always, you're important, but you're second priority, yeah, on a lot of things. So.
Kind of going off of that, do you feel like as the honors college got more centralized on campus and gained more exposure, do you think the university began to support it more, or do you feel it still struggles to get that support from the university?
I don't think it struggles as much now. I think it struggled probably until Bruce Meyer died. And I think the reason was that all of the people involved in directing it were Ball State people who stayed on. And when Bruce died, I ended up coming back to fill in, but then we went outside. And that changed the attitude. And it made it easier to say, well, I don't understand that. Why can't you? And Jim was able to do that, and I wasn't, and Warren wasn't, simply because, and Bruce wasn't, simply because we were already part of the big picture, and that big picture was not quite so honors amenable. We had lots of little battles. When we changed from quarters to semesters, for example, the attitude was make it equivalent. And we have a humanities sequence, a 3-semester now humanities sequence, which was 3 quarters long then. So that was 1 year. And when we put our stuff in for semester transition, we left it at 3 classes. So now it was going to be a year and a half. And the committee making all these decisions said, you can't do that. And I said, we have to do that. Because there's no way that the materials in those 3 quarters can be divided, that winter quarter stuff can't be divided and half of it dumped into the fall and half of it dumped into the spring, because it makes no academic sense. It makes no educational sense. And we had to fight like crazy, but finally got it approved to have it be 3 semesters. Now, that seems like a pretty simple thing. If you look at the syllabi and look at what's being presented and being taught in those classes, there was no way that it could be divided in a differing manner. But that didn't matter because it was not a year anymore, it was a year and a half. And that was a big battle. And as that happened with the general studies program, when the general studies program got changed, we developed it. Dan Goffman was a prof here in the history department, and eventually left to take a job at DePaul, but he volunteered to be in charge of developing an international studies honors class. And again, getting that approved was at least a year-long process or more. It just took forever to say, this will be an honors equivalent of what you're doing there. And I think in many respects, sometimes it was a fear that we were going to take all the best students out of the departments and hide them away in honors. And that was never the intent. But at the same time, we didn't want to have the best students always going to the department and not getting special opportunity if they were honor students, because that was part of what we were advertising and saying. We're going to present some special opportunities. We're going to make things a little different for you. And we still have to fight for that.
One of the things that you added to the honors curriculum was a global studies class, Honors 189.
Yeah.
And how did you feel that that addition would help further an honors student's education?
Well, that was the one I was saying. Dan was in charge of that. And what we thought was, we have the highest percentage of students who study abroad at some point. If you look at, overall in the university, honor students are the most likely to go and study abroad kinds of programs. So in terms of global studies, that was already almost a given. And then what we thought was, we had a Western civilization kind of cultural class anyway, the Honors 199. This would be such a good parallel course, and that we could talk about the cultural values this way and that way, and really, again, broaden the education and have our students really ready to go with both sides of the thing. And so we pushed very hard. As I said before, it took a long time to get it approved, but we got it.
So just as important as the students within the Honors College would probably be the faculty that are teaching the classes. So what type of qualities do you think make for a good instructor within an Honors College?
Somebody who's willing to say that a little extra here or a little extra there is just part of my life. Just recently was in a conversation talking about a fellow who's no longer hasn't been here for a long time, a fellow named Richard Wires, who taught for honors for years and years. And one of the students suddenly realized, gee, I'm in trouble. My schedule isn't going to allow me to get this one class that I need to be an honors graduate. And Wires found out about it and said, let's just do an independent study. And it turned out there was one other student, and so two of them came in once a week with Wires, and they worked for the whole semester, and they read a book a week, and it was, wow, wait a second, I'm reading a book a week, and Rich just worked with them, and he wasn't getting any pay for that. Well, think about it. Every student who graduates with honors has to have a thesis or creative project, and every thesis or creative project has a faculty sponsor. And none of them get to count that as teaching load or get paid extra for it. They just do it because that's part of education. That's part of what, and we have a lot of people here on campus who are quite willing to do that. We had a student years ago whose major was composition, and I went to his final presentation. It was a concert, and it was just absolutely spectacular, and finished with a choral work that he had written, and he had a choir of 32 people and 2 soloists and an orchestra of 28 people who all volunteered to learn this thing and play it for his thesis. And you think, wait a second, that's 60-some people who are just contributing to education. And fortunately, that's been, over the years, that's been the attitude again and again and again and again. And if you go to other schools, I did a lot of consulting, and I went to one school in Minnesota, I won't name, where what I was told by one person, they were thinking of starting an honors college. And it's the only time I ever wrote an absolute no. My final report was, don't even think about doing it. Because I had one faculty member say, we work 186 days a year, and that's it. And if you come in for 187th day, you'll get shunned by everyone else. It was that rigid, it was that crazy. And so I said, you can't have honors, because honors needs that 187th day or 188th or 190th. It's the expectation is that this will happen, and it does. And fortunately, we've got lots of people who buy into it and really enjoy it and like working with the students and like doing those kinds of things and enjoy helping them in the things that need to be done to make them well-educated people.
So you'd mentioned supervising honors seniors projects, and I believe you supervised John Lee's
Yes.
A History of Ball State's Honors College.
Right.
Why did you feel it was important that there should be a history of the Honors College for Ball State?
I didn't, John did. It was really kind of a funny thing. John, of course, was a pre-med major, and he came in one day, and I knew him fairly well, and he came in one day and he said, hey, I've just been doing so much lab research, I don't want to do more lab research right now. I'm still involved in this project and that project. He said, what would you think if I wrote a history of the honors program here? I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, would you supervise that? I said, well, sure. And so he just decided he thought that would be a good idea. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to help you do that. And that is how that came about. It was just that he'd had enough time in the bio lab.
While you were dean of the honors program, enrollment increased to over 1,000 students, but you still managed to be selective in the process. So how did you increase enrollment like that while still being selective?
I think good advertising and a lot of word of mouth as well. We got some people here for reasons sometimes that you just never knew, but we were attractive in many respects. We had one fellow, for example, who came here from Brooklyn, New York, and he was here for orientation, and I said, okay. I said, Brooklyn, New York, how did you? And he said, I want to be a musician, and my dad wants me to be in business. And he said, I looked around at what schools had good business college and a good music program and could offer a good education. And he said, I saw this honors thing and a good college of business and he said, Ball State was what I needed. And it was just getting the message out. We got Indiana University furious with us when one year we used the line, the only honors college in the state of Indiana, and we were at that time. And in less than a year, IU had an honors college. Because we were all of a sudden looking a little better than they, and we just found ways to get the message to students who would be attracted by what we were doing. And sometimes it was the combination of things. It was like music and business, or athletic training and physics, or a bunch of other. I still work orientation for the Honors College, and I had a student a couple of years ago, and I said, "So what are you going to major in?" And his answer was telecommunications and, God, now I'm blanking on what it's called. Isn't that awful? But it's the Homeland Security kind of stuff. And I said, "Really?" And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because I want to develop programs that can be sent by satellite using telecommunication skills for security kinds of circumstances." And I thought, wow, that's pretty nifty. You know? I don't know how he came, but he knew we had good stuff here. And so we got him to come here. And it's often the case, and sometimes it's the scholarship. It's simply, gee, this is, and unfortunately, many times parents don't understand that. I tried to convince one parent one time that it was going to cost them more money, and all the mother could say particularly was, "But we've got $21,000 from this other university." And I said, "Yes, but it's still going to cost you $21,000 more." And I said, "You can't pay at that point you couldn't. You can't pay $21,000 if we don't give your son any scholarships. You can't pay that much for your son to come here to Ball State, and your son's going to get a good scholarship here." And she still didn't understand. She just liked the idea that $21,000 a year, she thought that was nifty. So it takes careful presentation, but I think the university does a pretty good job of that. And we have been able to become more and more selective. The quality of the students just keeps jumping up very noticeably so. And it shows up now in things like national and international awards and a lot of other kinds of things. We have very successful students.
So you retired, you mentioned, for the first time in 1996. Why did you feel that was the right time to step back as dean?
Several reasons, but one of them goes all the way back to my childhood. I can remember, I was probably no more than 12 or 13 years old. I can remember saying that I'm going to retire as early as I can, if I can. And it was because of my dad. It was because he never had any of that. He didn't get to see his children grow. He didn't get to have any time off. He died. And the state of Indiana passed this rule of 85 that said if your age and your years of service add up to 85, you can get 100% retirement. And I was having breakfast with Vic Lawhead, who was involved very much with it. And he said, "Arno," he said, "don't you understand that every month you work from now on, you're working for 1 week's worth of salary?" And I said, "What?" He said, "You can retire on the 30th of June, and your take home will be 75% of what you're taking home right now." And he said, "You've got all kinds of consulting, and you've got books that you're writing, and you have other," he said, "You can retire right now very comfortably." I said, "That can't be right." And he said, "You go figure it out." And I did, and he was right. And so it took me another whole year to actually get all the things settled and put together. But yeah, I was 56 years old when I retired. And I think it was for that reason. And I'm in a second marriage, and the girls were very young. Kate, my wife, now had 2 young children at the time. And I got to do all kinds of things that I wouldn't have been able to do. And you know, when they were in high school, for example, I was the volunteer assistant coach for their tennis team while they played for 4. You know, it was more. It didn't have anything. It was the right time because I could get 100% retirement and because I still had good health. I still had, it's 23 years later, and I'm still enjoying it. I'm still playing lots of golf. I still have a nice garden. I still do the things that I enjoy. I read a lot of books and enjoy that very much, and I have no regrets.
So you mentioned that you were talking with Victor Lawhead, who was a former honors program director. Did you ask him or go to him for advice or anything about his experience as director?
Vic and I talked often, yes. He's the classic example of the kind of person that honors loves. He loved learning, and he also loved teaching. He continued to teach for us until he was in his 90s, and he would teach one colloquium class every year, and the students just fought to get in his class. He was that good and that loved. And he always was willing to help, always willing to share ideas, always willing to encourage, always willing to be involved. Just a really neat man. And yeah, we talked often. And Warren was in a sense much the same kind of, I guess once you get into this, you never get out of it. You know, it's that kind of thing. It's that important, I think. It's that satisfying. And I don't teach anymore, but I still work orientation for the Honors College every summer because I just want to be around that stuff still. I still enjoy it. I still like being there and meeting the students and talking with the other faculty members, and it's just part of my life.
So you'd mentioned Bruce Meyer took over for you after you retired the first time, but then he suddenly passed away, and you were asked to come back in 1998. What did that 2 years off give you new perspective for the Honors College when you came back to it?
Not too much, no. Bruce was just, in a sense, just really getting going and sort of developing some changes. And his wife was actually one of my former students, Ildiko, was a psychologist who was having sort of, I won't say midlife crisis because it wasn't, but a midlife decision, and Bruce was building her a bakery. She was going to run a bakery and had contracts with some restaurants to do the breads for them, and he didn't come home for dinner one night, and Ildiko went out to try to see what was going on. Was he so busy that he just lost track of time, whatever? She gets out to the side of the bakery and he's dead on the ground. And it was a hot day, and unfortunately Bruce was a smoker, and I guess the combination of that and dehydration, and he just dropped dead. And nothing had changed a whole lot. Nothing had really made he was working on things, but it hadn't changed so much that it was fairly easy for me to come back. The original intent was for me to come back for 1 year. We did a search. We offered the job to a woman who was an assistant dean at IU, and would have been absolutely terrific. And as soon as IU found out that we offered her the job and that she was thinking, yes, I'm going to go be dean at Ball State, all of a sudden her salary jumped considerably, and they offered her an opportunity to run a program in Italy. And she called and said, "Gee, I'm sorry." So then I stayed on for a second year, and we searched once again, and then that's when we hired Jim Rubel, and obviously he was terrific. He was just a wonder, and had a great tenure here. He did really good things, and it was good to have an outside person come in, and that helped. I think that helped honors education a lot. Yeah.
So looking back over your time within the Honors College, what do you think was your most impactful change that you made?
Wow. To a great extent, I guess I would say that it wasn't mine alone, but it was the fortune of Warren having been here, then going to be associate provost, then becoming provost, and having respect and love for honors education. And I would make suggestions about, I think we could improve, we could do this, we could do that. And I knew I had an ear in the ad building that was quite willing to listen. And actually we had two. John Worthen was terrific. Worthen was just a great president when he was here, and was very much tuned in to the idea that we could become a better university by building honors education on this campus and making it even stronger. And I had the pleasure one time of calling him in the late afternoon when we had a student here who was a tennis recruit, a female tennis recruit, and her dad was here with her, and she went off with some of the players and the coach, and the dad stayed back for a moment, and he came up and he said, "I want to apologize." And I said, "Apologize?" I said, "For what?" And he said, "I told my daughter that this was just a dumb trip to take, and that we shouldn't even go look at Ball State." And he said, "I was absolutely wrong." He said, "This is just terrific." And I just want to tell you, this is really, I'm so glad that she has come and she's seen this and knows about the honors and knows about the tennis and knows about. And I said, "Well, I'm really not supposed to ask you this, but who else is she considering?" And he said, the other three schools where she thought she might go play were either Dartmouth, Brown, or Northwestern. And I said, "Happy to be in with that group." And I called, John was a Northwestern grad, and I called him and I said, "Guess what? We're recruiting against your alma mater." and told him about this conversation. And that felt really good, that we were able to attract someone who was looking at two Ivy League schools and Northwestern. That was nice. That was the kind of thing that we would take pleasure in and pride.
So kind of going off that a little bit, is there anything that you feel that you didn't get to accomplish while you were dean?
Oh, sure. Well, the most obvious one was one that Jim did get done, and that was getting the housing changed. Not that Bossford-Swinford was bad, but with what else was on campus, it looked bad because all these other upgrades were going on, and the students could walk into some of the other halls and say, "Well, gee, they've got this. Well, gee, they've got that. Well, gee, they've got... Why don't we have any of that?" And I said, "Because you don't break anything." Yeah, the housing, that was probably, I worked, and of course I didn't have success in getting it in the center of campus either. I really wanted to move honors into the center of campus, and fortunately, Ed and Virginia were responsive to that eventually. You know, we didn't know that they were going to leave the house, and they had bought up a bunch of the properties when they went for sale around there so that things could be cleared out, so it could be landscaped, so you know, a lot of stuff could be done to make that really appealing. And they very much were supportive of honors education all along. Virginia hired honors students a number of times to work on some projects for her, and eventually there was the Virginia Ball, that whole program that Joe Trimmer ran, and Ed was the first non-faculty person to be selected by Whiting scholars to represent them at their senior dinner. They really got into it, and that was a big change, and it's been a very, very good change. You know, people come in and just, wow, you know, this is nifty. This is something special. You've got something going for you here, and we do, and it's nice.
You've mentioned that you're still involved with the Honors College to this day, and you've mentioned that we've expanded a lot since Dr. Rubel took over. But how do you see it continuing to expand and become more visible on campus?
I think there's still some things that could be done. For example, when John Worthing was president, this is another thing that never worked. The Mid-American Conference, along with all the other Division I conferences, signed this humongous contract for NCAA basketball, the March Madness. It's so many dollars, it's just scary. And I went to John and I said, you know, I think it would be pretty nifty if we could take a little bit of that money and at halftime of the Mid-American Conference basketball final game, we had a presentation where 2 students from each school got an award for special study because they were really great students who needed to, let's say, go study somewhere, so they needed financing money, or they needed a particular piece of laboratory equipment or whatever it might be. But we would just have Mid-American Conference scholars recognized on television in the middle of an athletic thing and make the Mid-American Conference an academic athletic combination. John thought, this is great. He takes it to the Council of Presidents and they all go, we're not going to spend the money on that. I still think there are ways we could improve things like that. I saw it as summer study. I saw it as students who wanted to get away, just couldn't afford to go, but wanted to get away and go, and this would cover, you know, this. And we were talking about, at the time there weren't as many schools in the MAC, I think we were talking about something like $48,000 out of these millions of dollars. And it got turned down. And you know, John and I still talk about that every once in a while. You know, like, what is the deal here? Or, you know, why didn't we succeed with that? But there are still, I think there are still any number of those kinds of things that might work out in the long run, that would still improve honors even more here.
How do you feel the relationship between the Honors College has grown with the university? I know you've mentioned that it struggled in the past and it's gotten a little better now, but do you think it'll continue to grow and that will foster more visibility for the Honors College?
I think so, for a couple of reasons. One is that the fundraising people, the foundation people, have finally recognized that maybe this is a viable entity to recruit. for years, if you said you were an honors college graduate of the College of Business or the College of Architecture and Planning, when they sent out requests, kinds of things, it was always from the College of Business or the College of Architecture and Planning. It was never from the Honors College. There was no direct solicitation. There was no opportunity for direct support. And we were always sort of secondhand, sometimes just by chance, sometimes just, I remember one time sitting in the office, it had to be the 2 years when I was in after Bruce had died, because it was out in Carmichael, and a former student was back, and we were catching up on things, and he said something about it. I said, we're doing well, Paul, but we're just running low on, and he said, well, how much do you need? And I said, well, we've got this one thing, and it would take about $2,500, and he goes like this and reaches in and pulls out his checkbook, and he says, here. And he writes a $2,500 check just like that. Well, all it took was asking. But the ask wasn't being made. It was always for Teachers College, or it was always for Sciences and Humanities, or it was always for something else. It was for Cardinal Varsity Club. But honors was low priority, and that priority has gone up, and we're getting more support from some of the peripheral offices that make it happen. Admissions is more supportive, foundation is more supportive, that we're getting more support, and that's making it easier to have a good, strong honors college, yes.
All right, so just to wrap everything up, is there anything that wasn't asked or discussed today that you would still like to speak about?
Not necessarily, but I know in many respects I could probably go on. There are lots of, when we talk about a history of the college, there are lots of sort of small crazy stories that I got a call one night, for example, and it was an administrator saying, the campus police have a bunch of your students, they picked them up, they'd broken into the art building. And I said, come on, what? Are you really serious? And this is like midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I said, yeah. And I said, you want to tell me what was going on? And they were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And somehow got into this elaborate, and that building had and they get picked up setting off the alarm in the art building. Well, that's not exactly honors education, but there are a lot of those kinds of things over the years, a lot of interesting sort of side stories. The woman who's the television anchor went with us to the National Collegiate Honors Council meeting in Las Vegas, and we were just walking into the hotel lobby checking in, and she saw this silver dollar, it was just on the floor of the lobby, and she picked it up and walked over to a slot machine, stuck it in, pulled the lever, and won $50 before we'd even checked in. And I thought, what? Come on, Laura. And over the years, I could go on. I could start telling you stories about students or about faculty people, and the kinds of things Daryl Adrian taught for us for years. And one year in the humanities sequence, he decided that he wanted his students to be more in touch with classical music. And he went to Leonard Atherton, who was at the time the conductor of the Muncie Symphony Orchestra. And he said, Leonard, could I bring my class over to rehearsal? And Leonard said, well, sure. Not only that, he said, but what we'll do is put a chair beside each, and you can spread your students out throughout the entire orchestra, and they'll sit with the members of the orchestra and be able to talk with them. And so the whole class went over to rehearsal and sat in on the rehearsal for the upcoming concert, and then they went as a class to the concert on the weekend. And who thinks of that kind of teaching technique? But it was marvelous, And Daryl, again, talking about giving up your time, Daryl just said, yeah, so it's a couple extra hours in the evening, so what? This is an opportunity for these students to really become well educated and know what's going on when this kind of thing happens. And so over the years, those kinds of things have just repeated again and again. There was a fellow named Bill from Fort Wayne area who was an actuarial science major, and he took a colloquium class from a guy in landscape architecture, and it was I'm sorry, what's the one with historic preservation? Anyway, with the preservation kind of thing. And he came to me and he said, can I have 2 thesis advisors? And I said, well, sure, if they'll both agree. And so he had one from actuarial science, and he had the fellow who had been his colloquium advisor together. And what he tried to do was use actuarial principles to develop affordable restoration housing for needy. Well, he ended up, eventually, his thesis sort of became his business. And that's what he does. He runs a business of restoration, and that is one of many examples. There was one student who came in, and I said, what are you doing next? And she said, well, I'm going back to teach at the school where I student taught. And I said, really? I said, that's great. They must have really liked you. And she said, yeah, well, what they really liked was my thesis. And they were adopting her thesis in the entire school district because of what she'd done. And then one of the guys in TCOM came in, and I said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going back to the station where I did my internship and thesis work. And I said, well, they must have really liked you. And he said, well, not the guy with whom I was working, because they fired him and hired me because they liked my thesis project so much they realized I was better than he was. And those kinds of things, there are a lot of those over the years. There are just a lot of those kinds of things that have happened in honors education here. And we've had the good fortune to have a lot of students involved in amazing kinds of things. And you just never know. One student who walked in one day and apologized for missing a Monday meeting. And I said, well, I was surprised because you've always been. And he said, I couldn't resist. And I said, what? He said, last Thursday night, my roommate and I were online, and he said, I looked at this make a bid on a flight kind of thing. And he said, I checked my bank account, and he said, I had $172. So I bid $167 on a round trip with hotel room to Vienna for the weekend. And they took it. And he said, I just threw stuff in my suitcase, and my roommate drove me to the Indianapolis airport, and I got there about 10 minutes and jumped on the plane, and I went to Vienna for the weekend. Those are the kinds of things you just don't expect, but in a sense, you almost do expect with the students who come here, and it's terrific. And is there anything you didn't ask me about? No, but there are lots of things I could tell you.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing those stories. And with that, we'll bring our interview to an end. On behalf of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, I want to thank you, Dr. Wittig, for participating in our project.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you.